Right. Hi, everyone. We'll just wait a couple minutes while people trickle in. Just so everybody knows, the session is going to be recorded today, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel later. So I think that's about everybody joined now. So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining this evening. I'm Finn. I help coordinate the Hare's Corner Clinic, and with me I have Mark McDowell from Hedgerows Ireland and Sharon Parr, who's a scientific advisor to the Hare's Corner. So for those of you who haven't been to one of these clinics before, we hold these webinars monthly, and they're on the second Monday of each month at 8 p.m. And they're just intended as a space where anyone can come and ask questions and get practical advice on what they can do for nature on their land. So we'll start with a short 15-minute or so presentation on our theme for the month, which this month is Wildlife Hedges, and then afterwards we'll have an open Q&A. And this month, the clinic is sponsored by Community Foundation Ireland through the Heritage Keepers programme. And both Heritage Keepers and the Hare's Corner are programs of Burmbeo Trust, which is a membership-based nonprofit. And yeah, if you want to, I'm sure you all know, but if you want to get involved or support us, we really do appreciate it. Or if you want to come volunteer in the burn, yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch. So we'll start our presentation in a moment. If anybody has any questions, just if you could put them in the Q&A box, that's the easiest way to keep track of them, and then we'll go through them at the end. So now I'll hand you over to Mark from Hedgerows Ireland. And if you haven't come across them, Hedgerows Ireland is a great organisation that works to promote conservation and nature-friendly management of hedgerows across Ireland. And their events I've been to one of their events before, they're really great. So go to their website, you'll find they have events kind of all across Ireland and talks and things. So yeah, we have a real expert with us tonight, right? So I will hand it over to you, Mark.
Lovely. Thanks, Finn. I am going to be sharing my screen with a slideshow presentation that I've given a few times before. It'll just kind of form the framework for the talk tonight. So I will do that now. Fingers crossed. Okay.
Yeah, it looks great.
Good. Okay. My name is Mark McDowell of Hedgerows Ireland, which is an organisation that was founded back in 2004 by a group of concerned landowners, farmers, and hedge layers who were very aware that there was no kind of policy or anything to do with consistent quality hedgerow management, and the hedges really had fallen into the clutches of flailers or people who had no interest in managing their hedges at all. Hedges were being filled with gaps in hedges were being filled with car doors, pallets, barbed wire, anything, and the hedge, which was such a vital resource for wildlife, had kind of was all around the country was losing its ability to provide resources for wildlife. So the main thing that we were involved with in the early days when we set ourselves up as the Hedge Laying Association of Ireland, and the reason for that is that hedge laying is the optimum way. You can see there at the bottom left a guy doing a bit of hedge laying. It's the optimum way of looking after a hedge. What you do is you cut the trees at the base 3/4 of the way through, bend them over. You can see there at the bottom left, the guy is has those trees cut and they're going over on their side. What's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is that below each of those cuts at the base, new growth comes, and it's the new growth that grows up through the hedge and becomes the new hedge. It's a kind of it's an odd concept. It makes the whole hedge very thick, very dense. There's a wonderful Dutch um, environmentalist, agronomist, a gent called Louis Dahlmans, who I've been lucky enough to work with a few times. Um, and he has the whole economics of well-managed hedges laid out, and the well-managed hedges for biodiversity. And the thing when I am laying a hedge, when you're doing this bending and putting these thin branches into position, you're always thinking about nest sites. You're weaving the branches together, and you think, well, that is a perfect little spot where something can nest, and nothing will be able to get at it because it's completely enclosed. And it's very easy to do. You become very familiar with that kind of way of managing of building the new hedge. Um, it's a kind of a it's a funny thing. You see it there, a human-made living field boundary. When you see a picture of the Irish countryside, you're looking at a patchwork generally of fields bounded by either stone walls or hedges. And these are the refuges of our wildlife, our wildflowers, most of our small mammals, some of our larger mammals, badgers and foxes. And there is absolutely nothing natural about it. These are straight lines, trees planted in a straight line, being kept small and thick by human management. But they have turned out to be a terrific resource for wildlife. And where you have a drainage ditch with the soil taken out and put into an earth bank beside it and a hedge planted along the top, you have everything, all our invertebrates and insects that live that spend larva time under the water for up to 3 years. Say in the case of dragonflies, they're accommodated in the drainage. The frogs, the amphibians, then you go up into the earth bank, all the little um, small mammals that will burrow into the bank, and butterflies will rest on the bare earth of the bank. And then the trees and the hedge itself, everything is has a space in the hedge. And the hedge, of course, is just is it's trees. It's a line of trees, and that's what they want to be. They want to grow up and be big, tall trees, and we want them to be quite low, quite thick, and in order to do that, we have to manage them. Now, the management system, as which I described, the hedge laying system, is a thing that has been going on for centuries and centuries. There's a wonderful description on the internet. You can look it up, written by Julius Caesar 2,000 years ago. He's in what is now Belgium. He's up against North European Celts, so there's no reason to think that the technology they had would be an awful lot different from our technology. He describes the villages as being encircled by hedges, which are bent and twisted and bound together with their bramble and rose, and his soldiers cannot even see through them, let alone get through them. Um, a thing about the whitethorn tree, the hawthorn, which is the backbone of most of our hedges around the country, is it's quite difficult to germinate. Some of them do germinate, but when you see the trees this time of year and they've gone red with haws, it's not like a sycamore tree. If you come back to that tree in April or May of next year, the ground is not going to be covered with little seedlings. coming out of all these haws that have fallen to the ground. Um, if there's one or two, it would be unusual. So where you see two, three, four um, whitethorns growing together, the chances are they've been planted. So when you see an ancient ring fort and on the bank there's four or five gnarly old thorns still left, our theory would be that they were planted, because if you have an earth bank and you want to make the whole thing completely stock proof, enemy proof, whatever, you plant a hedge on the top of it, and to keep that thick and dense, you would, like the Belgian tribes that Julius Caesar came up against, you would cut it and lay it. And it's I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that there's been hedge laying in Ireland probably for a few thousand years. Um, Hedges, we take them for granted. You know, we really do. And they produce so much for us, and lots of nice fruits, haws, hazels, spindle over here. Spindle is a great tree, planted as a hardwood, and it's only one or two would be on most farms. And it was where it, amongst other things, you know, Sleeping Beauty pricked her finger on the spindle of the spinning wheel. So it was made for, it was used in spinning wheels, but it was much more common use was it was the source of knitting needles. Um, Everything planted in the hedge had to produce, as well as being the hedge and keeping animals in, animals out. It also produced jams were made from haws. Um, Obviously, hazelnuts were gathered. Down here we have the Gelder rose. Not an awful lot was done with Gelder rose, and it's a native. It flowers the same time as whitethorn. It produces berries, very bright red berries, at the same time as whitethorn. It's quite often overlooked, and really, if I had put this together myself, I wouldn't have included the Gelder rose. We could have mentioned it, but it doesn't have a huge value that I'm aware of. People don't use the berries. Birds and insects, or birds and animals, seem to um, ignore the berries until there's absolutely nothing left. Um, Flying mammals or bats, they navigate along the hedgerows. You see the bare earth bank bottom right. That it's good to have a bit of bare earth on the bank, especially on the sunny side of an earth bank, as that will be used by butterflies quite often, just basking in the sun. It is important to manage hedges for various reasons. Flooding, flood control, the flow of water across the land is probably one of the most important. People take it for granted. They don't realize that the hedges are actually doing this until the hedge is removed, and then you get flooding events. The hedge, the bank, the ditch, all of it controls the flow of water. The hedge itself will be sucking up water, um, and there's just so much benefits from the hedge in terms of shelter, water management, the cattle and the sheep, cattle sheltering in the summer from the sun, winter sheep sheltering in the winter. Now, what I'm coming to when I say that we take it for granted, that's a wonderful slide that was done for us with all the different things going on in it. But I want to come to taking them for granted. Hedges are being still being removed at a huge amount every year. We're probably losing 1,000 kilometers of hedge. Now we're lucky; we have over 300,000 kilometers of hedge, but losing 1,000 kilometers every year, maybe more, will take its toll. Um, it's a thing that that people, when I say we take it for granted, what I mean is that it's possible to lose them. It is possible. It happened in the Netherlands. They used to have an awful lot of hedges. And now we think of the Netherlands, if you go there, just flat, open expanse of production land. Uh, but there is a small part of the Netherlands where the hedges survived. What happened to their hedges was at the end of the Second World War, at the very end, in the winter of 1944, there was starvation in Holland, there was famine, and a minimum of 20,000 people starved to death. Some figures are up at 80,000 people starved to death in the Netherlands. When they got back on their feet after the war, it was agreed by all political parties that that would never happen again, quite understandable. And they went into intensive agriculture, which involved removing practically all their hedgerows. Now they have their canals and their drainage systems. They're probably better prepared than most for the removal of hedgerows, but it can happen. Um, there's a small area around Boxmeer where the hedges have survived, and they now view them as a cultural asset, and traditional management of them is being revived. We go to that every couple of years, and 4,000 people show up to watch them managing their hedges. Um, some of those people will have driven 100, 150 kilometers to see a hedge. It is just something to be aware of. We can lose them if we don't take care of them. Management. These are overmanaged hedges, flailed every year. The thick trim line coming along the tops, gaps everywhere. You see gaps there. That gap on the photograph on the left, the gap just above the hedge in the foreground, that represents what, 15, 20 dead trees. Uh, the constant flail is too much for the whitethorn. It puts up with an awful lot, but you can see in the very top of the left-hand picture, the hedge in the background just giving up. It's giving up completely. And if hedges are overmanaged like this, they turn into they lose their biodiversity. They lose the very various species of tree, and they get replaced really just by elder, which grows very quickly, dies off quickly, leaves gaps. Elder, bramble, and thistle. Now they're not stock proof. They are all right for wildlife, but they end up looking like this. What is the big issue with a hedge that looks like this? If you have your hedges cut top and bottom, sides every year, you will get no flowers and berries. This is a thing I don't know how often I am surprised, and I shouldn't be surprised anymore, but I'm constantly surprised by this being news to landowners. Flowers and berries come on your second year's growth. So, what does that mean? Just what I said. You've cut them every year. You get no flowers, you get no berries, you get none of the associated wildlife. So, what do? You introduce a system that lets the hedge grow. You leave, maybe for various reasons, you have to trim the sides. You trim the sides if you must. But let the hedge grow up taller. Let it grow for 3 or 4 years. So it's got 4 or 5 feet of growth on top. Then you do an incremental cut and you take it down to maybe a foot above the old tree line, and you let it grow for another 3 or 4 years. Oh, hello. You let it go for another 3 or 4 years and take it down to maybe 2 foot above the tree line. This would be part of a system that you would introduce as part of a hedgerow restoration. Now, hedgerow restoration on pictures like these, on hedges like these, would involve laying it, and laying it, it needs the growth on top. But laying a hedge is an enormously invasive process. You have wonderful hedges that may look like that, and you cut out the branches in the winter, cut out the lower ones, and you lay them over. It is clearly very invasive. So but I mean, they come back wonderfully. That's the same hedge, what, 8 months after being laid, and it'll be full of nesting birds and um, that sort of thing. So it rejuvenates the hedge. It keeps the hedge young. Um, what happens then is, where was I going? The the hedge is gets rejuvenated. I just lost my train of thought for a second. Um, yes, it's so on your farm, on your land, you have 1,000 meters of hedge for laying every year. It's a system. Every year you just do a small amount, 50 or 100 meters, and uh, and you work your way slowly around the farm if that's what you have. And you're doing only a small amount. The resources remain in the hedge, in the rest of the untouched hedge for the wildlife, um, and you work your way around the farm. By the time you have finished that management, you're back at the start, and it's 20 years later, and the hedge is ready to be laid again. Uh, the life of a hawthorn tree is roughly 200, 250 years. Some of them will go on longer than that. But then they just fall prey to all the things that are attacking them, generally funguses, and you see them in the bottom of the tree, and the tree rots away and rots down into the ground. So when you do this system on a farm, constant management, you get eternal life. There are hedges now in England which they are looking at from an archaeological point of view, which have been managed for, and they think now some of them were planted in late Roman times. So you're looking at 20, 30-year-old hedges above ground growing on 15, 16, 1700-year-old rootstock. And you have all the mycelium activity, all the microbial activity, everything that's going on in the base of the hedge, uh, thousands of years old. And by far the richest soil on a farm is within sort of 10 meters either side of the hedge. The hedge itself is, I'll go back to this, is very, the trees are obviously very important, but the hedge spreads out. The hedge on either side is, on either side of the hedge is really important. The field margin is an incredibly vibrant area of ecological activity. And if you can leave 2, 3 meters, 4 or 5 meters, if you're up for it, at the between the crops or the animals and the hedge itself, what will grow, and the systems and the activity that takes place in that field margin is absolutely enormous and is of such value to all our pollinators, all our small mammals, and then the knock-on effect, of course, is that the creatures that prey on them have their resources, have their nutrients. So your blue tit with 10 nestlings is able to fly along the field margin, picking out the caterpillars and whatever that it needs for feeding the young. Blue tits may not be the best example. I mean, there's plenty of other birds. There's blue tits quite often nest quite early, and they come into another issue where we have the imported trees and uh, the trees that come into leaf early, and our insects have laid eggs on the tree that are timed to hatch for a later leaf burst. And when they do hatch, the leaves on the imported trees are already too tough for the caterpillars to eat, and they don't survive. So native provenance is another issue, a whole other issue. But I've probably used up my 15 minutes by now. Have I, Finn? Well over it.
Just about, yeah. That's great. I think we can move on to questions, and then if you think of anything as well that we haven't covered at the end, I'll give a few minutes in case there's any final thoughts. But thanks so much, Mark. That was really great. So informative. And I will first move on to some questions that have been emailed in. And you did already start touching on this, but the first question we have is, how can hedge cutting methods be improved? So you kind of went through some of the worst hedge cutting methods, but then and hedge laying. But what are some other better methods that can be used?
Um, an awful lot of it is the right tool for the job. Um, the flail is the go-to for councils and a lot of landowners. They're very common, very popular. You just drive along the side of the hedge, letting the flail do its worst. The flail is a great tool, and can do amazing work, but it really shouldn't be used on anything much bigger than your little finger. That's what it's designed for. It'll take out, the first year growth. It'll cut that quite neatly. It's when flails are let loose on overgrown hedges that you see the shattered stems, which we'll be seeing now for the next 4 or 5 months along the sides of our roads. And this can be improved on by a number of methods. The first would be a bit of planning from the councils and the landowners, so that they know what hedges are going to have to be cut in any given year, and they can have the right tool for the job. So if a hedge is an overgrown hedge and is causing issues at the roadside, I tend to focus on roadside because that's where we tend to see the worst examples of flailing. Um, councils need to invest in things like circular saws. They do a neat cut. They can be tilted at an angle, as the flail can, but tilted at an angle so it's sloping back sort of into the hedge, leaving it wide at the bottom, going narrower at the top. This will put a nice shape on the hedge. There's no there's generally not it's not necessary to top the hedge every year. Again, you can do an incremental cut, let the top grow, cut it every 3 or 4 years, just bring it back down a little bit, but never forming the tree line. A finger bar cutter is another thing that is perfectly capable of dealing with kind of third year growth, up to third year growth. And you know that it's a question of looking at what you have and respecting it. A little bit of respect would go a long way. The hedge is doing a great service all the time, and it tends to be viewed as a problem to be controlled rather than an asset to be nurtured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you've actually already covered our next question that we got sent in, which I know I definitely find it upsetting when, the time comes when you see all the splintered bits of the hedge along the roadsides, and I'm sure lots of our viewers do as well. So it's good to cover that there are alternative methods that can be used. But what would you recommend then for people maybe who aren't working on such a large scale, aren't working on a farm, or not the council, but someone working on maybe one field or a large garden, the best method for them to do their hedge?
Mm. Um, again, it depends. That slide that is there now is fairly typical of a very big hedge, and something that should be considered is coppicing. So that could be like that slide there could be the top end of a field that someone has, and it's gappy. Anything and everything can walk through that. There's not an awful lot of nesting in the base of the tree. They are beautiful trees, of course, is the other thing, but they are, you know, heading for the end of their lives rather than just starting out. So there is a form of management even more invasive than hedge laying, which is called coppicing. And coppicing is where you cut the tree, literally remove the entire tree, cut it nice and evenly at the base, about maybe 3 inches from the ground, a little bit less. If you can, a little sloping cut, so you get left with a tree stump. Uh, you do it at the right time of year, which is from now until really sort of end of January into February. And off that stump will come 6, 7, 8 new shoots. Now they have to be protected from whatever will graze on them. They have to be looked after. Coppicing is, I say, even more invasive than hedge laying. So, what would be considered best practice if you were to say take a hedge like that, say it's 50 meters long, is only do 5%, only do 2 or 3 meters, take out 2 or 3 of those trees annually and work your way along it. It keeps the resources because an awful lot of things are living in those trees, will be feeding on the berries. It is the least invasive way of doing it by just doing a small section annually. It's important to remember with hedgerow management, there is no quick fix. There's no, right, I'm going to get my hedges laid this year and do all that, and that'll be great. You just do a small amount. There is no mad rush. Do what seems appropriate and the least invasive way of looking after the hedge. These trees here, as I say, are heading for the end of their lives, and the rejuvenation process is important. It is part of the hedgerow system. As I said at the beginning, it's not a natural thing. It doesn't look after itself. It doesn't replicate itself. Or what's the right term? It doesn't, you know, new thorn trees are not growing up in that. So when you do coppicing, you'll cut out a tree and then find that there isn't actually another tree for another 2 meters. There should really be 10 trees in that 2 meters. So you do infill planting as well as the coppicing, and it builds the new hedge and it keeps the whole system going. Then it's up to you what form of management you do with your new hedge, whether you want to gear it for being laid in 10 or 15 years after you've coppiced it and planted in new trees, or if you just want to keep trimming it and let it get to this stage again. And it's all these things are systems, and you choose your system and stick with it, and your hedge will remain healthy. But it is important to remember that if they're not managed, we do kind of, we slowly lose them. They stop being the wonderful resource that they are.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a little at a time is definitely a good way to start because it can often seem overwhelming for people, I think. I was
Yeah.
wondering, Sharon, do you have anything to add on that, different ways for people to manage their hedgerows?
No, I mean the only thing is in terms of incremental cutting is one of the is to do it the reverse way in terms of if you're starting with your hedges a bit lower, particularly roadside hedges, one side's always going to have to be kept cut But rather than sort of letting it go for 3 years and bring it back down, maybe letting it go up a bit more each year. So you've got older woods. So maybe cutting in at 10 to 15 centimeters higher each year, to let it up to a certain height and then maybe bringing it back down. But I'm not sure how many of the contractors are actually that clued into incremental cutting, or how easy it is to do with a machine. I know it is done, I've seen it done, but not really in this country.
Mhm. Thanks. I'll move on to some of the questions in the chat now. So the first question we have is, what would you suggest as a nice hedgerow mix for a new hedgerow near the burn? And maybe we'll answer for near the burn first, and then just generally across Ireland, if we're thinking about, I suppose, wildlife hedges.
Um, I think hazel is quite a common one around the burn.
Yeah.
The other way, I mean, hazel would be a good basis for it, but have a look wherever you're thinking of planting a hedge, have a look at what is growing, what is already working locally. It's likely to be whitethorn and hazel, a lovely mix. They do work very well together. Holly, I don't know, is holly common?
Yeah, holly's very common in the
In
burn
some
as well.
places.
Okay. Um, because one of my favorite sort of mixes of hedge, which would I think work on the burn, and would certainly work roundabout or in most of the rest of the country, is um, whitethorn, hawthorn, uh, hazel, holly, and dog rose, and that makes a beautiful hedge, and it's strong and it's productive and it's so rich in resources for wildlife. And by all means, then plant in a crab apple, a cherry, whatever is growing locally. We have two species of wild cherry. A lot of people don't actually seem to realize we do have wild cherry here. It's a great tree in that it is one of the first to produce its fruit in the first couple of weeks of July. You have fruit on our cherry trees, and that's very important for a lot of birds with feeding nestlings. So then also, I'm not sure what would go as a standard. Is the burn is pretty windswept. I don't associate it by memory with having standard trees on it. So I think you're looking um, more at a low hedge, which will be the whitethorn and hazel and holly and dog rose is I think that's probably my favorite hedge.
Yeah, just in terms of the Borough, there's plenty of sheltered places, and I mean, quite things that do quite well here, that will grow as smallish standards maybe, are things like birch, white beam,
Mm,
mountain ash in some places as well. So, but slightly lighter canopy. Um, Ash would have been, but it's not a non-runner because they're already under so much water stress here.
yeah.
Then the next question we have is, um, I suppose a bit more technical or maybe speculative. They've asked, do you think that planning conditions in rural areas could be asked to keep a percentage of hedging in future? Just like in the West, some houses have to have stone walls. I don't know about this for planning conditions, but it is my understanding that there is legislation that protects hedges, and you're not allowed to remove more than a certain amount, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's enforcement issues are as always a problem. Um, I think it would there's planning regulations. It would be lovely if they could tell you certainly what not to plant and make recommendations about what to plant. You know, Griselinia and Portuguese laurel and the other Robinia, is it, for whatever that one is, are so popular. And I mean, it really shouldn't be allowed. And I'm not in favor of government telling us how to live our lives, but honestly, the amount of that stuff that is planted and presumably recommended by landscape gardeners to people on what to put in their gardens. I mean, I see Leylandi still being planted in small gardens.
Mm.
It would be very nice if there was a serious attention paid to what was planted in gardens. Gardens are becoming, as agriculture intensifies, gardens are becoming increasingly important as refuges, especially for pollinators and small birds. Um, it's it's hard to know exactly how you would get people to want to do it, because they're quite sold on the evergreenness of Griselinia and laurel, and they think that that's probably the best privacy. There has to be a whole change of attitude as well, just in terms of planning and retention of hedges. I have awful stories of people. There's one in Rathcoole or Kilcool, I can never remember which. Uh, one in Kildare, one in Wicklow. Uh, but anyway, the local community activist group got together to have hedges preserved on an area where there was being going to be developed for housing, and it ended up in court, and the judge agreed with the local community group that the developer's plan of putting in a thin row of probably imported whips um, somewhere else on the land would, as mitigating the removal of a well-established 100-year-old, couple of 100-year-old hedge along the front. The judge agreed and said, no, this is not the same thing. You must keep the hedge along the front, and it was a great delight. But the developer just took out the hedge and paid the fine. So that is an issue. That is
Yeah.
that it has to be the fine has to be a deterrent, and it has to be, there has to be a lot of enforcement.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think enforcement is a big issue. And yeah, I suppose, yeah, you can get in touch with your local council or National Parks and Wildlife, depending on where you are, if you think someone has taken out more hedge than they should. And we will move on to, we have a few questions about planting new hedgerows as well. How do you start a new hedgerow? For example, should you plant it along a stone wall? And if you are planting a hedge, is there any merit putting it in 2 trees thick so that you can create a more dense hedge with more space?
Yes, the double row is probably the best way to do it. If you have 5 trees per meter, and maybe you plant one on the left, and then with a 20-centimeter gap, plant another one on the right, 20 centimeters ahead. So you have one left, one right, one left, one right, and you have 5 trees in the meter. It does make for a denser hedge. It also is very handy if you do opt to lay it 5 or whatever 8 or 10 years after you plant it, because the trees can then be laid kind of crossways rather than laid on top of each other. You can see it in that slide. In some of them, the trees are coming down right on top of the tree in front of it. Whereas if you can put them crossways, it's just a much easier way of doing it. If you are planting, um, if you're anxious to get a thick hedge as quickly as possible, there is a method where you cut back the trees pretty much the day you plant them. Cut them back to a couple of inches high. Now they need this. Make sure that you're planting a hedge where they get sunlight. They'll need to be protected, whether by some sort of mulch, but they don't need to be competing with all the wildflowers and things. So it'd be good to walk along the sides of the hedge, trampling the wildflowers maybe once in May, once each month of the summer if you can manage it, but at least twice in the summer. When you cut them back to this size, when you plant them in the following spring, that will put out 4 or 5 shoots off that little stem. So where it would have been just one little whip, maybe waving around in the wind, you'll have 4. The next tree will also have 4 and 4 and 4. And they very quickly start supporting each other and growing up. And within 3 years, you have a really recognizable hedge there. Trim the sides of it, even from the first year, from the certainly into the second year. Trim the sides a little bit. That encourages new growth at the sides, but where the cuts are made on the side, you get again new shoots, more than the shoot that you just cut. You get 3 or 4 shoots, and you get a very dense side to it, and encourage it to grow up. There's that's
It's the density, the distance between planting also not influenced by your end point. I mean, the very close planting with high densities per metre was more when people were putting in hedges for stock proofing, whereas a lot of hedges these days aren't really needed for stock proofing because people don't tend to rely on a hedge for stock proofing anymore. So is there maybe also for cost sake, a, a, a different sort of midpoint planting distance rather than the 20 centimeters?
Yeah, and it's quite possible. I'm just used to the 20 centimeter, Sharon. So that's what I tend to trot out. It does, the plants are closer together, so that if you are doing the cutting back system, where they will then start supporting each other. But I mean, it's not vital. It's you could do 3 plants to the meter, I expect, but it will be a thinner hedge. And I'm always thinking in terms of density at the base, just for wildlife, for birds nesting. There's a lot of small birds will be nesting in and near the bottom of the hedge. The denser it is down there, the happier I am. But it's not vital. And it certainly will cut down on costs by when you remove one tree per meter. I suppose you're cutting down your costs by 20%. So yeah, certainly something to think of.
Just because we're on this slide, we have a question about hedge laying, and they just ask, should you just cut 3/4 of the way through the trunk and not all the way through? And I suppose this at least, that's
that it is, and it's 3/4. It's possibly a bit more. You want the tree to be going over easily rather than you pushing it over, because when you push it over, it starts to sort of split back up and can get messy. But yeah, I must go on to the next slide. That's that same hedge a little bit afterwards. New growth coming up there along the bottom. The next slide, I think, is the most impressive. That's that hedge a year after laying. That is 1 year's growth coming from the base. And then you see what I mean about these the new growth becomes the new hedge over the next 10 years or so.
Wow, yeah, that's an
Yeah.
amazing transformation. Yeah, I think it's always a lot of the management strategies can look very brutal immediately after they're done, but things do bounce back so
Oh, they do.
quickly,
Absolutely. Yeah.
um, which is important to remember. And that slide kind of, I think, illustrates a question we have um, on managing old hedgerows that have basically just turned into a line of trees, including hawthorn, rowan, willow, sycamore. And it says, should I plant young bushes alongside and then lay them? So I suppose, is there any benefit to also planting alongside a hedge that has been laid, or do you just let it come up naturally?
Um, there is, I I know a farmer, one particular farmer who always does it. Um, we lay a hedge for him and come back a few years later, and he has planted a new row of trees always in front of the laid hedge, and it makes the whole thing very difficult for trying to work with, because you're trying to work with the trees he's planted in front, and then there's the old hedge in behind and the new growth on that, and it's tricky to work with. If you have what has become a line of trees and you want to plant a new hedge and say you don't want a coppice, it is still possible to put in a new hedge, but there's a way of doing it, which is again it's a time thing. You would take off the lower branches to well above head height, of the existing trees. Then you might find that you've got a 2 or 3 meter gap to fill in. The trees that are there will be using up an awful lot of the water, an awful lot of the resources in the soil. If you plant a row of little whips into the into that gap, they will struggle. A few of them will survive, but some of them won't because they just can't compete with the existing trees. But there is a way of filling those gaps.
Mhm.
If you buy your whips, your new little trees, and plant them in pots, again, it's a long-term process. You cut them back, as I was saying about the planting the new hedge. You put them in a pot, single tree in a pot, cut it back to 2 or 3 inches. The following spring, that'll put out 3, 4, 5 shoots and grow up and be quite tall. You cut them back to about 2 or 3 inches above your original cut. So your 5 things are cut back. They're probably about 6 or 8 inches above the ground. The following spring, each of those shoots puts out 2, 3 new shoots. Then you have a strong little bush in that pot. Then you go out to your gap in your hedge and dig a hole, maybe put in something to for the new tree to feed on, but it probably won't be necessary. You
Mhm.
plant that tree, that bush into the gap, and hopefully you've done this with 20 other trees as well, and you plant them all into the gap, and they will hold their own. They will survive. They are strong enough where a single small whip blowing in the wind may struggle. That's how you fill the gaps in an old hedge.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. Um, that's a good practical piece of advice. We only have a few minutes left, so we might try and get through a few questions quickly. Um, but if there are any questions we don't get to, I will try and get back to people individually as well. But so someone has asked, how can you tell um, when a whitethorn tree is reaching the end of its life? And I think you already said that typical lifespan of a whitethorn is can be 200 years.
Yeah, between 200, 250.
Yeah.
Um, you will see the rot. Essentially, you would see that dry rot in the base of the tree.
Mhm.
They it's it's very powdery, dry stuff. Cracks come in the bark, and you see this on the inside. That's that's the real one. I mean, if a tree is big and strong and healthy, and looks big and strong and healthy, and you examine it and don't see anything like that, well, then it's still doing okay.
Hmm.
But
Great. Thanks. And um, you mentioned how bad some evergreen hedges are, like Griselinia. Would you recommend just removing them as a whole then if they're already there?
um, yeah, I mean, if you want your wildlife, yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think
Um,
so. Um, I'd like I don't think there's anything to be gained by partial
mhm.
removal.
Mhm.
No,
Yeah.
I think you remove the non-native trees and put in the ones that would support the insects and the birds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And um, someone else has asked, um, what would you recommend for an exposed seaside area? You said to look around and see what's already there, and they said hag's head, gorse, and blackthorn scrub are here mostly, but what else could be planted? And also a related question that came in is blackthorn a useful species for putting in a hedge?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, blackthorn and gorse, terrific hedge.
Hmm.
Um, the sea is, whitethorn will grow well enough near the sea if the soil is okay. Um, it doesn't need to be particularly special soil, but on the sea side, it gets burnt off by the salt, especially on the west coast, and you have wonderful sloping trees, which may have a kind of a 5 meter span
Hmm.
as the tree bends away from the salt and the wind. Um, I think gorse and blackthorn, if they are what's there, that's what you tend to go with that, because if there isn't any sign of other species being used or other species thriving, then you're probably going to have a pretty frustrating time, unless that's one of your unless you like to see how things work and will it work, and you can do experimenting. But if you want to get the hedge up and running, um, go with what's there. Gorse is a great hedge, and you can lay it, and it responds perfectly well to that.
Hmm.
Um, the blackthorn as a hedge plant, it yes, it makes for a very good hedge. It suckers. It suckers and it suckers and it suckers. If you have a 2 or 3 foot wide blackthorn hedge and you don't do much with it, and there's not grazing in the land, when you come back to that 2 or 3 years later, it will be 5, 6, 7 foot wide. It just suckers out in off the roots, and it needs to be controlled. That's one of the main things with blackthorn management is controlling it. It just controlling the spread of it.
Yeah. Um, I know it's 9, so we will wrap up. I think there's literally two more questions, which I think will be quite quick. Someone has asked, they're putting in a new hedge and species to include specifically for pollinators. Um, aside from the ones you've already mentioned, are there any specifically that you'd recommend?
Crabapple is lovely. Cherry is lovely. I know I have mentioned them both, but I wasn't sort of harping on them.
Hmm.
Um, the, the trees that I have mentioned are very good. It's also that would bring us back to a kind of a margin, a wildflower margin. If you can establish that on either side of the hedge, there are a lot of good wildflower mixes for sale at the moment. You do have to be quite careful, I think, about making sure that you're not planting imported ones or non-native stuff. I'm I wouldn't be an expert on what is the best mix to plant,
We would
but
probably say not to plant any mixes that you buy. Just it's generally best to steer clear. I think they're often
mhm,
have non-natives. That's our overall. I
okay,
think if you really want some wildflower seed, you can do things like green hay or collect your seed yourself. But yeah, I'd say steer clear of the seed mixes.
but I can't think of any trees in particular that I've
Mm,
neglected. The the Gelder rose, maybe it's great for
It's,
pollinators.
hmm
I mean, it's a beautiful tree. It's just it we it's not something that is used that we harvest in any way. You
hmm
don't hear of Gelder rose wine or Gelder rose berry jam or ever. So it's uh, it's
it,
overlooked
it,
that.
att- it attracts a lot of hoverflies. The one thing I put in, because a lot of hedgerow plants are quite short, have quite short flowering periods, and it's quite hard to get a good seasonal continuity cover. So, I mean, in wetter places, a bit of willow in early, very important early pollinator plant, but you can't beat brambles. Having some controlled brambles in a hedge, they flower for a long, long time. And that's where a lot of hedges that I was looking at in during the summer, where all the insects were, the bees, the hoverflies, etc., were the brambles. So if you don't want it taking over a hedge, but if you can have some in on the sunny side, and also the one that people don't like is ivy. Again, if you can have some ivy, but you don't let it take you over, it's a very important plant for pollinators in autumn.
Yeah, ivy is hugely important. Um, I was talking to a bee guy uh, recently, and he said that something like 70-80%, if we get a mild November, 70 or 80% of the honey produced in Ireland will be from ivy pollen.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah,
Mm.
my garden is just a basically a mess of brambles and ivy at the moment, but I was down there a couple of weeks ago and the ivy was just covered in butterflies, just completely. It was amazing to see.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think we're probably always harping on about that, but often the things you don't like are the things which are best for wildlife. We will wrap up now, but I wanted to ask Sharon if you have any final tips you wanted to share. Um,
You put me on the spot. I think my brain's turning off now. Um, no, again, it was something that was said earlier, was that thing of looking at what is already growing in your area and doing quite well. Again, when it comes to these coastal plantings, quite often you'll see whitethorn. They might not be the biggest, but sometimes, again, with coastal areas, possibly it's the use of a non-native initially to give shelter to allow other things to establish, and then you can get rid of the non-native at a later date.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, both of you, and thanks so much, Mark, for joining us. It was great to have you on, and yeah, I think there is a couple of questions we didn't get to, but we will wrap up now, and I will respond to those questions separately. And just so people know, the recording is going to be put on our YouTube channel. So if there's anything you didn't catch or you want to revisit later, you can do that. And um, we will be hosting another clinic next month, which is going to be on orchard care with Irish Seed Savers Association, and that's going to be on the 10th at 8 p.m. So we'll be very happy to see all of you there as well. And I will put the link to that in the chat, along with also the link to Hedgerows Ireland website, which I would definitely recommend you go check out. It also has loads of resources on how to plant hedges, how to manage hedges. So if you're looking for some further reading, that's a great place to go. So yeah, thank you very much, both of you. I hope you have a lovely evening, and I will close out, but I'll leave the Zoom going for a while so people can have a look at the chat and take any links that they need to. So thanks very much, Mark and Sharon.
Very welcome.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.